Hello, and welcome to You Should Hear This, a podcast for the everyday association professional. I'm Nick Estrada, your host. Association professionals often describe themselves as experts on membership, meetings, education, and a variety of other topics. However, one area which many prefer to avoid is legislative advocacy. These discussions and battles often feel overwhelming and force us to navigate an area of work that we aren't comfortable with. We find there are new forms to complete, compliance to ensure, and that's just with the government. That doesn't even take into account how we manage these conversations with our members to best help advocate for them or to protect their ability to operate and do their jobs. Today, we've got a great guest who can help us understand how to approach advocacy and how we see this play out in ISAE to support our own industry. Our guest is Kim Williams, MBA, Vice President of Association Management with the Corridon Group. Kim has over 28 years of experience working with membership organizations and began her State House experience as a Senate intern in 1987. She's worked with the Indiana Academy of Ophthalmology since 1989 and has served as their executive director since 1994. In addition to her management responsibilities for the associations, Kim serves as the lobbyist with the Indiana General Assembly and other regulatory agencies for the associations managed by the firm, as well as working with clients of the firm as needed. Welcome, Kim. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Nick. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about a topic that is one that honestly, probably many of us prefer to typically shy away from if we can, but I think we've got a great expert here for us today to talk about it. So before we begin, can you just tell us a little bit about your journey, how you've gotten to where you are today, and why advocacy is so important to you?
Of course. As a lot of people in my position, I started out as a poli-sci major who was planning to go off to law school and go work in a big corporate law firm and make scads of money. My journey didn't go there. I ended up doing an internship with the Indiana Senate that you mentioned, and I fell in love with the process and with policy. And I knew after my one semester as an intern, being in a courtroom was not going to be my destiny. I chose not to go to law school. I do have a number of colleagues as lobbyists that have chosen the law school route, but you don't have to be an attorney to be a lobbyist. And that's probably a myth number one that we can start crossing off of the list today. You don't have to have gone to law school. I have been involved in particularly healthcare since the beginning of my lobby career. And I just have continued to do those type of things. I fell into the association world, which again, a lot of us do. Not many people, at least when I was in school, set out to be an association executive. That wasn't a course track to follow. But, my love for associations and governmental affairs has served me well, and I'd like to thank the associations that we manage and do governmental affairs for.
That's great. Yeah, it's a common theme, I think, right? That we find, I think, ourselves falling into some of these positions and then really finding a passion for the work that we're doing, and then it becomes our career. It's exciting.
It does. And I've had some great mentors. Starting off my career, I have worked with former speakers of the House and former chief of staffs to the governor's office. I've worked with other big policymakers in the state. Currently I'm in a firm now that we have people who have been state senators. We have people who have served in the administration, in different administrations, or have been lobbyists for other associations. So it's exciting to have all of that kind of interaction as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we think about advocacy or legislative affairs, however, right, some associations may call it different things, but as we think about that umbrella, I feel like it's a pretty broad topic sometimes. I think there's a lot of components that could go into advocacy. So as we start our conversation, can you tell me how you would define advocacy or how you would start that conversation maybe with somebody who hasn't done a lot of advocacy work?
In my world, it's one sentence. It's building relationships between your association and policymakers. That's what advocacy is. those people who have an opportunity to interact or intersect with the association at a policy level, whether it's federal, state, local governments, if it's a regulator in an agency of the state, if it's, city and town governments. Anybody who has the ability to change something that happens within your association, being a policymaker, it's all about that relationship. I think you're right, Nick. It's so many people think about elections as advocacy, and that's what they think about advocacy. It's about so much more than that. Dealing with those policymakers and helping them to understand what it is that we're advocating on behalf of.
And how do you, if you don't have somebody on your staff, right, who is a specific person who's in charge of this, how do you start to build those relationships? How do you make the time to actually go and make sure you're doing that, and to really identify the appropriate people that you need to be building those relationships with?
That's a huge question. And the lobbyist in me wants to say, well, everybody needs to have a lobbyist. But the lobbyist in me will also say, you probably already have a number of lobbyists and you just don't know it. So many of us already have lobbyists. If you belong to professional associations, or if you are a part of your homeowners association where you have policymakers that are interacting with you as a homeowner. You are your own lobbyist. So I think it's a matter of understanding who it is you need to have contact with. It's a matter of understanding what your goal is. And then that's an easy way to decide who you need to talk with. We all have assigned policymakers. You live in a Indiana House district. Mm-hmm. You have an Indiana state senator. It's important to know who those people are. You have a U.S. congressperson. You have two U.S. senators. Knowing who they are, knowing how to reach them as a constituent, and making sure that if something is an important enough matter to you, that you do that.
So if you're starting this process, right, how do you determine what is the best person to reach? So you're mentioning, right, like knowing your federal and your state level. How do you decide what's the appropriate place to go? Because I think a lot of associations, automatically just assume that lobbying is primarily at the federal level, right? And if we can't lobby at the federal level, then what's the point, right? So is it a different approach when it's federal versus state? Is one more important than the other? I don't know. How do you kind of play or hedge those bets around the advocacy table?
And they are very different. There are different rules and requirements, particularly if you are professionally doing that and not just as a constituent. So if you as an association have a governmental affairs representative, the way that they interact at the federal level is very different than the way that they interact at the state level. There are reporting requirements and lots of hoops to jump through, and transparency and all those good things that we want to happen in the world, because those are things that we need to know about, but also knowing that they are different. But again, professionals will know that and would be able to help you step through those issues. If you're doing it as a constituent, it matters on what it is you're advocating on behalf of. If you want to talk to, if you have a problem with your passport, it happens a lot. You need to talk to your U.S. senator or your congressperson. If you're concerned about your taxes that you pay at the state level, that's your state representative. So those are the kinds of things that I think, knowing where your issue is and what it is you're advocating for determines on where you're going to go.
I think a lot of associations will try to shy away from advocacy sometimes, right? Because it does feel overwhelming, and especially if it's a state by state kind of thing, right? So we're a national organization maybe, but we operate obviously everywhere. And so we've got to think about how that plays out in each of the states. What are some of the key resources then that an association should make sure that they have in place so that they can tackle those situations in the variety of localities that they might have to go and advocate for?
So again, a lot of this does depend on if you're a national association where you're housed in multiple states, or if you're a state association. A group like ISAE, for instance, has a governmental affairs committee. I've served as co-chair of that committee for a number of years. And one of the tools that we make available to our members here in Indiana is a bill track list. So as pieces of legislation become available to the public for review, we review all of those bills and put them on a bill track list so that the members of the association can go look anytime during the legislative session and see what's out there. What pieces of legislation are being considered by the state legislators? What is it that they're talking about this session? At the federal level, that's a lot more complicated. Mm-hmm. And there are different tools to use that you can go look at all the pieces of legislation out there. Obviously, I have to be an advocate on behalf of ASAE. They are a tremendous resource and do a fantastic job at the federal level on advocating on behalf of associations and to keeping on top of the issues. They have resources through that organization, which help with associations generally. However, if you're trying to decide, my national association that I am now running, pick your association, we'll use ophthalmology because we mentioned that in kind of my bio. There is an Indiana Academy of Ophthalmology, of which I have been a part for a long time. And, we advocate at the state level on a variety of issues. The National Association does work with the federal government, and they have government relations folks, just like we have here in Indiana, that talk about those bigger picture things. So, they have resources available for their members. I mean, there are all kinds of tools out there, voter voice or quorum or ways to connect your membership with their federal legislators. Lots of tools are available for each association.
I think as we think about legislative issues, and I think this happens even just personally, right? I don't typically care a lot, maybe, about legislative things that are happening until suddenly something has come up that impacts me directly, right? And I think we see this a lot with our members of our own associations, that we don't hear a lot from them until suddenly a state passes some kind of a tax bill, or there's some kind of employment bill that passes, or there's some law, right, that gets implemented without their opinion or without their input, that changes how they have to do business or their licensure or their certifications, you name it, right? But that we probably didn't care a lot until suddenly that happens. And so how do we get members of our association to care about these things when it doesn't seem like anything is impacting them yet, right? And I hate to kind of play this like doomsday feel, right? Like something's going to come up down the road, so make sure you're focusing on this. But how do we keep them engaged in that process?
Nick, if I can find the answer to that, I'm going to bottle it and sell it to every association across the country, and I'm retiring and moving to an island. I think you're right. And I think that that's part of the problem or the goal, or, that's something that has been a strategy for our Indiana ISAE's Governmental Affairs Committee for a number of years, is how do we engage the members? How do we show the members that while you don't think that the Indiana General Assembly affects you, it does. Mm-hmm. Again, you've mentioned paying your taxes, certifications, where your kids go to school, when school starts, they set the start date, what all of these things happen, and even to all of those type of issues matter to our members. And how do we make sure that they understand that this is important, because a lot of people see what's happening at the federal level. It's a little dirty. It's not something they want to get involved in. They think it's kind of ugly. They just don't want to get involved in politics. So how do I, as a constituent, as somebody who wants to have my say with my policymaker, how do I have my say without kind of getting my hands dirty? I think is probably ultimately the question you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a matter of keeping it in front of our members. I know that, a lot of the associations that we manage, they get weekly legislative updates. They have a bill tracked list. We have programs where we talk about this at conferences. It's a matter of continuing to show them that this matters as much as what continuing education program we're going to host next month. These things matter to the association as a whole. If we're going to pay sales tax on services, and the legislature's having this conversation. And there are lots of things that matter on a day-to-day basis. It's up to us to make sure that our members understand the importance of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I like your concept of just constantly putting it in front of them, right? Like, even if I don't read it every single week, at least it's there, right? And I can recognize that maybe, now I see that thing is happening. Maybe that does impact me. And maybe now I pick up the phone or I hit that reply email, and I get in touch with my government affairs folks.
Well, I will say, as much as I hate to admit it, long-time user, long time been around this world, when I do these membership surveys and do membership surveys across a variety of industries, and our firm does manage a variety of associations across a variety of industries, when we ask, what do you find to be the most important member benefit that you get from the association? Advocacy is normally the first or second thing that they have. And I think a lot of that reason is they want their association to do it for them. They don't want to have to do it for whatever reason. Our members are a little afraid. This isn't something that's in their comfort level. So that's not something that they're looking to do. It's outside their comfort zone. So they're not looking to do that. It isn't, kind of their thing to do. So they are looking for us as their association to make sure that their voices are heard. And so I think that making sure that we're doing that and we're letting our members know we've done it matters.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting concept of they care a lot about it, but it's not something that they want to do. And I think I understand that, right? Like, that is a concept, I think, of part of why you join an association, right? It's that concept of being stronger together, and that I'm not the one that has to go and fight the battle. There's a group of people who I've entrusted with the ability to go fight for me.
I mean, we all have checkbook members, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
We have that member who's going to write their membership dues payment every year. We may never see them at an event. We hope that they're reading their e-blast and their newsletters as they're getting them, but you can always count on them to write that check. I think a lot of ways that our members count on us to handle governmental affairs and advocacy on their behalf that same way.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. So one more question before we get to maybe some tactical experience from just the ISA realm. So we're talking about, right, different ways that members might be engaged. So we've got the checkbook ones, right? The ones that are just going to say, do it for me. Sure. Thanks so much. Really appreciate that. Can't wait to partake in the benefit. But I also think we have some who they're like, yeah, I want to be a part of this discussion. And I want to make sure, I think especially for trade associations, if you've got, a business owner or a company owner or whatever, right, that really wants to make sure that their opinion on whatever bill or whatever policy is kind of in play is going to be at that table, right, to have that discussion. So how do we balance the needs of members and the needs of the association / industry as a whole when we're having these policy discussions, especially when we're having them with those policymakers? Because I think a lot of the times, I've heard this in my own association before, that will non-members get a benefit from our legislative work? Well, yeah, they do. Absolutely. But we can't not do the legislative work, right? Because somebody else might get a benefit. So how do we balance all those opinions to then go to that policy maker and have that discussion?
Well, I think, you're exactly right. And it's even bigger than that. I mean, within some associations, certain policies benefit certain members at a different level than they benefit others. Or sometimes they are at odds with each other. I would say that's probably less likely, but it can happen. I think that's when you have an active governmental affairs committee, a group of leaders who can take that and listen to the sides and put together those talking points and move it forward. I mean, it's all one thing to say, the associations that we manage have a lobbyist. And yes, I have a lot of experience in the General Assembly, and I've been over there for a number of years, but I don't do anything without any of our legislative committees giving me kind of my marching orders to do that. I mean, our members are still our experts, right? And it's more than just being an expert in, the next professional development program that we're going to put on. They are, the experts in the industry. And I truly do think that making sure that we have a governmental affairs committee that has the authority to make quick decisions. I think that's something, and, this is probably farther down the rabbit hole than we want to go, but, I think a lot of associations tie the hands of their governmental affairs committee by wanting to make sure that there are processes that have to be met before they can go testify on a legislative issue. And unfortunately, those things move fast. This is the short session of the General Assembly. It started this last week. Things are going to move quickly. And we are already starting to see pieces of legislation come out of committees. So that means there has been committee testimony and committee activity. Well, if we would have had to have gone to a governmental affairs committee, who then would have had to have gone to a board of directors, or executive committee, who went to a board, you have a multitude of steps to jump through and hoops to jump through. The association may not have gotten their position heard. So I think that that's something also, is to making sure that our associations have the appropriate response kind of criteria for these quick moving issues that happen, at least at the state level. It most definitely is not quick happening at the national, at the federal level.
Yeah.
But at least at the state, in almost every state, things happen at a pretty rapid pace.
Okay. So the more local the issue becomes, typically the faster it's going to happen.
The quicker it moves.
Okay.
Not surprising.
Yeah. Makes sense. I guess at some level, right? Fewer people to have to vet it through and all those kinds of things. Yeah. Okay, well, you said maybe this isn't the rabbit hole we want to go down, but I think I'd like to. So you're mentioning, right, many associations typically will, kind of tighten the reins then on that group. So what would be kind of some of the guiding principles? So maybe an association doesn't have a legislative affairs or a government affairs committee yet, or they don't have, right, some of these things. But what would maybe be the top three things that if an association is thinking about putting a group like this together, what are the top three things that they need to make sure are in place to allow that group to be responsive enough, as you're mentioning, right, to be able to quickly move? But maybe there are still some restrictions that need to be in place. But how do you, right? So how do you balance? What are the top three things that maybe a group needs to be thinking about?
Yeah, and well, one, I think it's making sure you have the right volunteers to serve in that role. I mean, people who understand the process, people who care about the process, people who don't have their own agenda in the process. So I think that's probably number one key in that whole thing, is making sure that you have the right people at the table making those decisions. I think you have to make sure that your board is all bought in and willing to give up a little bit of authority. It's very easy to say, these are the guiding principles of the association. I mean, we all know what our guiding principles are. I am not going to, as the lobbyist for, again, we'll use ophthalmology because they're my good example. I'm probably not going to go to the legislature and advocate on the gun bill. Probably just not going to happen.
Right.
I'm not sure ophthalmologists have much of opinion on that. So I think, setting those kind of parameters early and making sure that we all have those same goals matters. And then again, making sure that we're following through with compliance. And I think making sure that we have a good legal plan. And I know that sounds kind of scary, but it doesn't have to. But making sure that we are being transparent where we need to be. So if we need to file something with the appropriate legislative body, or in Indiana, and again, it's kind of my world. As a lobbyist, I have to register with the Indiana Lobby Registration Commission. I do as an individual lobbyist, and each of the associations that hire a lobbyist have to register with the commission. So not only do you have to tell the commission that you are paying to have a lobbyist and that you have a professional representation, but then you have to twice a year let them know how much you're spending to do that and what you're spending money on. At the federal level, I mentioned that they have federal requirements. Same kind of concept. You have to go through that same process. There's a registration process. And I will say, in Indiana, we also have that at the regulatory level. So if you are even advocating with some of the agencies, the governmental agencies, and you are a professional doing it on behalf of an association, there are those requirements. And that means somebody who is actually getting paid to do that job. So it's not just somebody like me who works for a lobbying firm that the association has hired, but it could be an in-house person as well. So if Kim Williams is the in-house lobbyist for the Indiana Academy of Ophthalmology, I still have to lobby registration commission and go through that process. So I think making sure that those would be the top three things for me. Making sure you have the right people at the table, making sure that everybody has the same goals and objectives in mind, and making sure you're compliant and you have a compliance plan in place.
Yeah, I like the idea of adding that compliance plan, right? Because I think ideally it would make it a little less overwhelming.
That's right.
If you know the dates, because all those things are already codified, right, for you. So these are the dates I have to submit the paperwork. This is the kind of paperwork we have to submit.
Absolutely.
And I think that makes it more approachable for sure. And as you mentioned, right, if I'm lobbying in many states, potentially, I need to be thinking about that for the several states that we might be doing that in, because each state might have slightly different rules.
And likely do. Different rules, different requirements, different processes. I mean, I will say, in Indiana, we are a first dollar registration person, so I have to claim, no matter if I take a legislator for a $75 steak dinner or a $4 Starbucks coffee, I still have to report that there is no dollar amount. In other states, and I believe Kentucky is one of them, you can't take a legislator and do that type of entertaining. So knowing what the rules are makes a big difference as well, which is why I think that compliance plan is so important.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you. We're going to transition now to, you mentioned that you have been the co-chair of the Government Affairs Committee with ISAE for a few years. And so I want to, talk a little bit about, and hopefully for our listeners, we can draw some comparisons or some ideas right from the work that Kim and her team have done for ISAE, and we can think about how we can apply those to our own associations. So can you just briefly maybe talk about what are some of the things that ISAE's Government Affairs Committee has done or accomplished on behalf of our members?
Sure. Well, I think, again, we mentioned previously that we manage a bill track list. That bill track list changes on an annual basis, and it will change throughout the legislative session. It is posted on the website. It is posted in almost every e-blast that I see. It's a click here to see the bill track. That is a live link, so you don't have to wait for somebody to update a bill track. If a bill changes on the House floor today, as soon as that happens in the system at the State House. Your bill track is updated. So I think, there's probably number one quick thing that happens. The committee has done a lot of work with, again, trying to generally raise the profile of governmental affairs. We've done that through a lot of different ways. And, when I stop and think back about some of the topics that the Governmental Affairs Committee has brought to either convention or through special standalone webinars. A few years ago, we did a session at convention when the exempt status was going to change and the dollar amount was going to change on what people could be considered exempt and non-exempt. That session was put together and held by the Governmental Affairs Committee. A couple of sessions ago from that, we did a session on kind of emergency communications and contingency planning. It was kind of one of those, oh no, something's come up and this is bad in our association. Now what do we do? Those are all things that we think of in governmental affairs. So the Governmental Affairs Committee has continued to bring those type of issues. We've stayed on top of, in particular, charity gaming issues in Indiana and made sure that our members understand as charity gaming rules have changed. A lot of us hold raffles or silent auctions or, you name it, what we kind of do with our associations, and making sure that our members understand as charity gaming has changed throughout the process, how that affects all of our associations and what that looks like. One of the things that I am most proud of, and I think I would like to claim a little bit of stamp on, is Association Day at the State House. The association has done for a number of years a legislative luncheon, and we did a great legislative luncheon, and members always enjoyed coming to lunch and hearing the 4 caucus leaders come together to talk about issues that were happening at the State House. And that was great, and it kept our members informed, but it didn't raise the profile of ISAE or associations with the legislature. We kind of listened to them be talking heads. So I had long advocated that we needed to do something in the State House. We needed to take ourselves to them because they weren't going to come to us. And so we have been doing Association Day at the State House for a few years now. And it's our chance as the association community in Indiana to show our strength in Indiana and to be in the State House, to be in the rotunda of the Capitol, to talk to legislators as they come by to visit with us and to learn about what ISAE does and what each of our individual associations do, and talk about the strength of associations and generally hospitality in Indiana. We don't leave our hospitality, partners out either. But I think that's probably one of the strongest things that ISAE does for our membership, is making sure that we are on track with that and making sure that we have good data to share. ISAE has some wonderful information that we can share about, how many associations are housed in Indiana and how many people that employs and what does that do to the bottom line of the state. And those are things that matter to legislators and more than legislators.
Yeah.
I will mention our relationship with the Indiana Lieutenant Governor. Lieutenant Governor in Indiana is in charge of tourism. That's, one of the roles of the LG. And I think the LG in Indiana understands ISAE, has attended our Association Day, spoke to us at convention recently, and shared her views on associations and how we're all working together and, how the state works. And I think, again, relationships. You'll hear me use that word time and time and again. And those are the things that truly matter in advocacy.
I think that's super interesting that you mentioned, right? Like that's something I've learned just today. I didn't realize that part of the lieutenant governor's responsibility was tourism.
Yes.
I think as we think about then, right, our own associations and where we might need to lobby or advocate for our own industries that we might represent, thinking about who might be in charge of that vertical, that trade group, that industry, that profession. Because I think if we can get into the person, right, who is responsible for that area and we start to build that relationship, then when something does come out that would impact that, that's our go-to person, right? I think that's super interesting, right? That now that would be a person, right? If again, something impacts all the meetings and all the associations in the industry, right? Again, that's somebody we can go to and say, hey, this is not good for us and therefore not good for Indiana and not good for you as Lieutenant
Absolutely.
Governor.
And I think that's exactly it. And I can't emphasize enough that it's more than just your elected officials. Don't get me wrong. They're ultimately important. And the governor and his role and the legislature and their role. But remember, there are a lot of state agencies that matter. And that is advocacy also, even on the regulatory side. We always think about passing a law and passing a piece of legislation and what that is. But there are also things called administrative rules, which are as equally important and have the same strength as a law. It just came through an administrative process. So I work with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management regularly for one of the associations that I work with. And so having a relationship with IDEM matters, making sure that those IDEM folks are invited to events, that we make sure that they're on our speaker list to come and share their updates. So there are all kinds of ways to enhance our offerings to our members, while at the same time building our relationships with regulators.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, making sure that you understand and that our members and associations understand that it's more than just those elected officials where we have to be good advocates. There are others in agencies, and it might be somebody that's surprising. I think you mentioned workforce at one point. We work a lot with workforce development in Indiana. And I think, that's probably an area with the association world that we could maybe develop even a closer relationship.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we think about, right, government affairs should not just be one singular person, right?
Nope.
Can draw a line here similar to membership, right? Membership is everyone's job. Government affairs, building relationships is everyone's job. What are some of the key roles then that an ISAE member right now, so a listener even potentially today, what are some of the key ways that either they could get involved or some of the key roles that they could play in government affairs?
So I think number one is know who at least your state and federal legislators are. I always say know 2 names. It's really like knowing 5 names, but let's not get crazy. If you know who your state legislator is, who your state senator is, if you send an email to them and introduce yourself, if you say, I'm Kim Williams, I am, a member of ISAE, and this is what ISAE does. And I also am the executive director or the membership coordinator or the event planner for Name the Association, and my association cares. But more than anything, I want to offer myself as a resource to you. I think that is probably the number one biggest thing that our members can do is make sure they know who their legislators are and that they start establishing their relationship before they need to ask for something. We don't have an ask this year. We may have some things we want to fight, but we don't have an ask. And that's good. Let legislators know who we are, that we care before, we're pounding down their door to either say, I need you to do this, or I need you to not do that.
I appreciate that approach, because I think, again, that lends itself to this: how do we keep members engaged throughout the year or whatever, right? Because I don't want to just reach out to somebody. I think when we think about our own members, right, we want that same thing from our members. I don't want a member to call me just when things are bad. I want a member to be reaching out all the time, to be talking about the things that the association could be doing better, ways that could improve, or things they appreciated. Those are the kinds of members I really appreciate working with, not the one that just calls me up every time something is wrong. And I feel like there's a parallel there for building that relationship with a legislator or regulator.
You are absolutely right. And more than that, I think you have to remember that in Indiana, our General Assembly are citizen legislators. They are not professional legislators. So they all typically have a job back home, whether it's, they're a farmer or an attorney or a business owner or an insurance salesman, you name it. We have legislators with a variety of jobs that they do when they're away from Indianapolis. But because of that, they can't know everything there is to know about all the topics that they are going to hear. It is not unusual, once you get later into a legislative session, that in the same day, a legislator might be interacting on a piece of legislation affecting the state budget, something to do with taxes, something to do with education, a healthcare issue, probably an environmental issue. There could be some very large social issue that they're hearing a whole lot about on a social issue level. So legislators have to know all of these things and be able to interact on all of those bills. Again, in Indiana, our legislators don't have professional staff to help coordinate that. Typically, a senator probably shares a legislative assistant with 2 or 3 other senators. In the House, it's about the same workload, 3 to 4 legislators per legislative assistant. And then during session, they have interns. They do have the Legislative Services Agency attorneys who help kind of put the words on the paper. But when it comes to doing research on all the different information that they need to interact on a certain topic, they need to rely on experts. And that's why our members need to offer themselves as experts.
I love that. So if you're listening today, 2 big things. 1, know who they are. And the second, make sure that we're communicating with them before we need to ask, either for something or for them to not do something.
Absolutely.
I love that. Well, Kim, thank you so much for being with us today. I think we've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, which is really exciting. I think that this is, obviously, again, a very overwhelming topic for a lot of people, but I think this conversation helps make it digestible, and I think helps to begin that starting point of where we think we can go. A couple final questions before we close out. So if you had one piece of advice as you look back on your career around advocacy, what's one thing you wish you knew when you first started this kind of work?
It's to be involved as much as possible. I think as a young person getting involved, I was intimidated by some of the longer term lobbyists in the hallway and in governmental affairs, and maybe didn't put my foot forward as much as I should have. I wish I'd have done more of that. I think I had something to offer and may have held back, but I think just being involved more regularly and following my own advice. I'm not sure I do a good job of advocating on my own behalf with my legislators because of what it is I do, but making sure that we do that kind of thing and being forward facing with our legislators.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for being with us. If folks want to get in touch with you, they want to find you on social media, all those kinds of things, how can someone find you?
Sure. So I am on Twitter. I am on Facebook as Kim Stanley Williams. Love to connect that way. I'm also on LinkedIn, Kim Williams. the Corridon Group website and my kwilliams at thecorridongroup.com email. Welcome all of those opportunities. Happy to have a conversation about starting governmental affairs committees. If you have concerns about compliance, any of those type of things, always happy to have those conversations. I think, Nick, there are so many things. I mean, we didn't even talk about political action committees.
Right.
We
Yes.
didn't even talk about, fundraising and all of those type of things that you can do to further a relationship with a legislator once you get to know them. There's another hour worth of conversation to have.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have another episode, I think, in the future on those kinds of things Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode of You Should Hear This. If you have any questions you'd like answered or future topics you'd like for us to explore, please send us an email at info@ise.org.